everyone, and welcome again to another session of our Zoom podcast where I invite instructors to share with us either some of the technology they've been using in their own writing program classroom, or maybe to talk about some of the literate activity and focus on how they're preparing as instructors to give a course. I am Edcel Javier Cintron-Gonzalez, the current professional development technology coordinator of the writing program, and it is my pleasure to present today my guest for today, Leslie Hancock. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Leslie Hancock. I am currently a master's student and looking to be all wrapped up with everything by the end of summer 2021. Fingers crossed, right? So I have been teaching in the writing program for a couple years now. I've only been teaching the English 101 classes, but I have been doing multiple sections of those. And today I'm going to be talking with Edcel about my literate activity and how I go about designing the class. So I'm kind of thinking about tracing the tools and the resources that I'm using and the texts that I work with and the text that I'm producing. For my students or for myself and how I design the class before any of the class even gets like in front of the students or in the students' hands. So it's very much just going to focus on sort of an instructor perspective of how we might go about designing the class. So I'm sort of investigating my literate activity in today's podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie, so much for that wonderful introduction. And I have to say, it's really an interesting topic because can you believe it's been a year since, well, a year and a little bit more since the pandemic started, but since we've been like I guess not only introduced, but also adapting to the world of online teaching. Um, I don't know, for me, it's been a crazy journey. I've never taught, well, currently this year, instead of teaching 101, I was teaching 170 Intro to Children's Literature. And it was quite an experience teaching literature in an online forum. So how has been your experience like teaching during the pandemic or adjusting to online teaching?
Yeah, I think that the hardest part of it for me was honestly when we had the transition in the spring 2020 semester. We started off in person, and then the spring break, we were told we were going to be online. So making that very rapid transition in, like a week or a little less than a week was really, that was the, I think, most challenging thing because I hadn't really considered, what teaching online might look like. So I think that transition period was the hardest because it also required that I adapt some of the original unit projects that I was thinking about doing. So I was in the middle of my third unit project with my students, which actually involved having them do a Kickstarter campaign for card games and thinking about genres and teaching chat at that time. When we're thinking about the activity system of a Kickstarter project or, how card games are, produced and put out into the world, right? And how people then take these games up and maybe play them with their family or friends. So we were thinking about things like the trajectory of the games, right? So we were in the middle of that unit, and the students were supposed to actually start making card games, and that just went out the window. That was literally the next step of that project. And then we were told we were teaching online, so it's like, okay, guess I'm adapting all of that. That's not happening. So the fourth unit project was my grassroots project, and because of we lost a week, in that semester because they gave us that extra planning week, right, for moving online. It kind of messed with my schedule a little bit, so I had to quickly adapt my plans so that I could make a shrunken down, shranked it, whatever, what I'm trying to say, version of a grassroots unit, right? So I call it the grassroots mini multimodal project, where it's more like a synthesis learning thing. Neither of those is the focus of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm actually going to talk about my second unit project. I think that other than making the rapid transitions last spring, I thought that planning for the fall, I was teaching two sections of English 101, was actually a really fun challenge for me. I was really excited to do it because I kind of liked the idea of trying out teaching online, so I thought it was interesting. But I also thought that it could open up for different kinds of project opportunities that I don't know if it would have been harder. It's one of those things where I think I would need to try the project in like both a face-to-face class and an online to see how it goes and how that compares and how students respond to it. But I think that the students the kinds of projects that I changed, and I pretty much completely redid my course plan from the spring to the fall for the online teaching. But so that was a lot, right? But I think it was necessary for trying to, meet this new format we were teaching in. But I think the students really responded well to the projects that I did because they were much more like multimedia focused and using digital technologies, which of course we kind of had to, right? Which is one of the things that I think is interesting about tracing my own literate activity for teaching online. But I think that it was just difficult to think about what unit projects would be feasible in an online situation that wouldn't need like really regular class meetings, because my goal was to keep my class as close to asynchronous. I keep calling it like hybrid, but I know that's confusing because that's an actual like hybrid asynchronous is a thing. It was mostly asynchronous with occasional class meetings. So, we might go 2 weeks without having a meeting, and then we would have one, and I would only meet it was a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. I never had classes on Fridays, so Mondays and Wednesdays it would be they had to sign up for one of those options. And then we would do, whatever I felt like we really had to have a class about, whether that was like introducing a new unit or talking about self-assessment or doing some community-based assessment practice work, which I did a lot more in my first unit, and then we did more self-assessment in later units. So depending on what the need was, we might meet, but otherwise it was mostly asynchronous. So designing the class around that, I think was one of the harder parts for me, but it was enjoyable, especially as the semester went on and kind of adjusting plans as I go.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds really interesting too. And it just brings me, sorry, back to, I don't know, the kind of anxiety I had as well teaching 101 at that time, especially because we were actually doing our grassroots unit because I decided to do it the second unit versus the third. Um, and I don't know, even though it worked out, I felt like it was a lot more work in a sense because not everything is clear in a Zoom session. So I had to write like instructions by scratch and very detailed step by step instructions so students can follow along what they're reading and doing asynchronously. And then I can work with them synchronously throughout the process of writing a grassroots article. Um, so hearing all that, it really shows you that it does take a lot of planning and prepping in order to really organize an effective class, whether you decide to teach it online or even asynchronously or even a hybrid model too, because that also takes a lot of work because it's not only planning what you're going to say at the moment if you're meeting them via Zoom, but also how you're going to follow along with that in your learning management system or in your teaching space.
Yeah, yeah. I think that it's interesting hearing you talk about how one of the things you had to do was like write more extensive project descriptions, because I found that was something I did as well. Um, so when we're thinking about the learning management system, ReggieNet specifically, right, which is kind of the focus of what I'm going to be talking about today, and how I was using that tool, right? I think one of the things that I found very important about that was not overwhelming students with information on like the ReggieNet space itself, but thinking
Hmm.
about how we can get these more like detailed descriptions that they might need for asynchronous learning, make that still easily available and accessible to them so that information is there and they know how to find it, but not overwhelming them with too much information on the lesson pages themselves that you make for ReggieNet. So mhm.
Yeah. And I think that's really important too, because oftentimes, and I'm gonna admit this, I'm not the most ReggieNet verse as you can get. Like I can manage all the functions and get the information out there, but I think it is a true organization or an art form, like really getting these detailed instructions and file documents and everything organized so neatly that it's really accessible for the students to access them. And just thinking of other classes I've taken or other classes that I've been in where it's kind of hard to find documents or certain instructions within the ReggieNet space, especially depending how one organizes the task, for example, or how in lessons things can get real messy, like real quick, if one doesn't like structure it in a way that it's really like student friendly.
So that's actually a really nice transition into a short presentation that I have for today. We can stop and talk, of course, during the presentation. So if you have any questions or anything that you want to ask while I'm talking, that's totally fantastic. So let me go ahead and get that pulled up here.
All right.
Okay, great. Okay, so just to kind of quickly take this back to the question of like, why are we reflecting on our literate practices, just to kind of set the stage for what I'm going to be talking about in a moment here, relating back to ReggieNet and thinking about how we organize it. I just wanted to quickly reference Kevin Rusin's Unraveling Writing article from our most recent Grassroots Writing Research Journal issue 11.2. He was talking about in his article, like, why do we, think about our literate practices? Like, what is the use in doing that? And really, as he says, it helps us understand how our literate practices impact the text that we create and use, the texts and tools we inherit from others, and how we creatively and continually reshape them for our own purposes. So it's thinking about like how we use the things that we use, why we're using them, how are we shaping them, and how are we spreading those things we make out into the world or for others to use, and how they pick up then those texts and use them themselves, which is one thing we often see as instructors, right? Is, how our students take things up is maybe not always how we intended, right? So one of the things that we can think about as instructors is not just how we develop things, but how we are thinking about the ways that we develop them, how we are composing them, right? So I think that looking back at our literate practices and our activity and how we design and structure things is useful, because as I say here, the second bullet point, it's kind of giving us that look at the behind the scenes of teaching. So what are the teaching resources or tools instructors pull from to design their classes? And then it gives us that pause to reflect on, how are we constructing our classes online? But I also want to reiterate that while we are in a moment right now, we're in this pandemic moment, right, where we're living online teaching. For future instructors, just because you're not teaching online and you're teaching face-to-face, that doesn't mean that you're not still using tools, right, to teach your class and thinking about how you organize your class. And we are always, I think, going to be using ReggieNet through ISU. So one of the things that we need to think about is, I would say, even especially as we go back to face-to-face teaching, is thinking about how we are utilizing our learning management system, our LMS. So how are we using ReggieNet for online and face-to-face, and can we continue with some of the things we're thinking about for online course design with the face-to-face, like keeping some of that and carrying it with us into the future. And then, of course, thinking about the accessibility of course materials for students, like ease of access and navigation. This was a really driving kind of goal for me when I was thinking about my course design, is I want to make sure that the online, resources and lesson pages and whatnot are very easy for students to access, and that they can very easily find the information that they're looking for. That was kind of a core component of, thinking about accessibility and ease of access and navigation. That was a core goal for me as I was designing my class. And then, of course, thinking forward to revising for the next iteration of the course. So what technologies worked best for me, what didn't work so well, what do the students find accessible, and what was difficult for them to navigate. As a quick example of this, my students, very early on in the course, in week 4, had a optional class period where they could come and give me feedback on like what technologies were we using in the class that worked for them, what was, something that was difficult for them, like maybe they were having trouble with like using their phone or using their laptop or whatever, and like something wasn't playing nice. And all the feedback that I got said that my students were just not liking Flipgrid. Flipgrid was not playing nice with them. Sometimes they had to record videos multiple times. I was not an expert with using Flipgrid. Since then, I've spent more time on it. But at the time, it was still a very new technology to me. So even though it was something I was trying out, it wasn't working for my students. So in future iterations, as a result of that class's feedback, I actually stopped using Flipgrid. But in future iterations, if I were teaching online 101 again, I would probably still opt not to use it, because I just don't know that it was necessarily working for me or working for students in the way that I was hoping that it would. Not to bash Flipgrid, I'm sure it's a fabulous program. And I'm sure other people have great success, but that just wasn't working for me. So when I'm thinking about my literate practice from English 101 last semester, when I was thinking about this class that I taught, Flipgrid was just not working for me. So one of the reflective moments that I had was thinking about that tool. And then what other tools or resources do I have access to? And are they an improvement over current tools? For example, Edcel is one of the people who has completely sold me on Padlet. I think Padlet is a better version of forums, especially over the ReggieNet forums. So going forward, I would probably likely get a Padlet subscription and use Padlet over the ReggieNet forums, especially because it's cheap and I just like it so much more than the ReggieNet forums.
Yeah,
So again, thinking about tools that I have access to, but I'm not using, and thinking about how that works better with, the kind of literate activity I'm trying to do or what I'm looking for from my students.
yeah. Um, this is all great. I want to touch quickly back on a few things. So it's interesting that you mentioned Padlet because currently CTLT does have has bought a few subscriptions of a full version of Padlet. So instructors can actually go to their website and actually ask them to let them use a Padlet license that they already have bought. And I think it's really accessible that way too because, well, because in the past we would just have to make a multiple Gmails to get free access to Padlet, and that's only limited to 3 boards, and that's it. And that's not ideal for a full semester of forum teaching. So I'm glad that we have that resource now through CTLT. And I was really interested too in the idea of really how can we transfer what we've learned during our experiences online teaching into going back into maybe an in-person or hybrid model classroom, because it's funny to think about it because I was having a conversation with an educator colleague of mine that they were like they were like a little bit stressed out because of the in-person models that they're doing their institution. But then I'm like, well, in the past, if you were able to give, for example, if it's 3 days a week and Fridays for just forums, and you had the option to teach that asynchronously, that's kind of what we've learned for the online model, that classroom instruction does not necessarily have to be 100% in person for it to be successful. There are other ways that we can adapt our teaching and our modalities, not only to give students more access in that way, but also to even out and match like our learning goals and what we want to do as educators in order to achieve that accessibility and kind of balance of technology too. And I think with the boom of technology that we can use in online teaching, that can easily be transferred to
Mhm.
other modalities as well. So I find that super fascinating to think about.
Right. And I think some of that comes back to this, like when I talked earlier about how I had to sort of reimagine what the projects would look like for this class, right? I think that some of it is, it's very easy for me to fall into the trap of like, oh, I like my projects that I had from face to face, so I'm going to make them fit in online. But the reality is that I designed those projects around the fact that they would be sitting in a classroom together, right? And that's just not happening with online teaching. So I had to reimagine what my projects would look like, for like what unit projects I was doing and how they might need to be realigned, or address new learning objectives through the writing program that maybe I wasn't touching on as much before, but now I'm centering more with the online learning. So just making those shifts. And I think also that, considering not just the projects and kinds of assignments and whatnot that we're asking them to do, but also, as you mentioned, thinking about how we're using ReggieNet in both face-to-face and online. I would venture a guess that more people are using ReggieNet more extensively this past year with the online teaching than maybe they had prior to, being online. I think a lot of us learned a lot more about ReggieNet than we were expecting we were going to. But I think that the things that we have learned are still, useful and valuable going forward back into face to face, because I see ReggieNet as an opportunity to really help with the organization and structure of the class and how we present information to students. So, and which that goes that will get us into ReggieNet as the main topic of what I wanted to talk about today, is like the primary tool that I'm focusing on when I think of what was kind of the grounding backbone tool of me designing this class. And really all the other tools that I used all came back to ReggieNet, because everything was like, ReggieNet it can embed YouTube videos. Awesome. ReggieNet can embed Google Docs. Awesome. Like all those other tools are great, but ReggieNet is really the vehicle through which I shared all the course, resources. Um, So I have kind of two columns here. I have one for my goals, like specifically, these are the things I was thinking about. These are the things I cared about, like my teaching pedagogy and what I value as an instructor for an online class. And then the tools and resources I was thinking about using or did use to make that like come to life. So for the goals, I was thinking, I want easy and accessible navigation. I want to make sure the information about the class is very clear. So things like the class meeting schedule, weekly work readings or assignments, unit projects, due dates, grades, syllabus, all of that good stuff. I wanted to make sure all that information was readily available online. I wanted to make sure there was a lot of transparency about what was happening in the class. So kind of answering that "so what" question, like why are we doing what we're doing? Why does this matter? So making sure, like I say there, clear explanations and descriptions or how projects align with learning goals. So I wanted to always make sure that everything we did in the class was grounded in learning objectives from the writing program, with clear explanations of how this is, how this matters to their lives beyond the walls of the classroom, the online virtual walls of our classroom space, beyond the Zoom boxes. Why does this stuff
Right.
matter? So I wanted to make sure there was a lot of transparency and that was always readily available on a ReggieNet, lesson page, on my site. And then opportunities for student collaboration, for students to share their work with peers. That was a little bit trickier for me than I expected it to, until I was like, hey, Google Drive. So ReggieNet acted as a hub to a lot of external resources, and Google Drive was used really extensively for my class. So slides, docs, embedding videos and audio from Google Drive folders, all of that those were all the goals, the things I really cared about. I am not going to read through this giant list of tools and resources, except to say that I was realizing these were different things that I knew I was going to be using or that I thought I might be using. I wound up actually using all of these things at some point or another during the whole semester. So the ReggieNet tools, as I say in that sub bullet point, the lessons tool was the thing I used the most extensively. And I'm going to show some pictures of how I set a page up using the lessons tool in a moment here. So the things like the forms, resources, and so on, I used all of those, but the lessons one was the one that was really core for me to like design and deliver the content of the class. Thinking about, creating documents and presentations, images. I would like to point out that the Adobe suite, all the programs with Adobe are free through ISU. So if you are someone who wants to do video or audio or image editing, go check out things like Photoshop and Spark. They are fantastic for doing editing work and making the images. Screen recordings and video presentations, I use Screencast-O-Matic, which is also available through ISU. You just email CTLT and they will send you a code or whatever and a link to get it. YouTube was where I uploaded all the videos that I knew I would be making and presenting to the class, and then I had hyperlinks through ReggieNet. And then I actually found that it's interesting because one of the resources that I recognize for how I designed this class was the other writing program instructors and the students themselves. I remember that a while back, gosh, I can't remember if it was 2 years ago now, or time means nothing anymore. But Brianna Tidmarsh showed me her ReggieNet page for her classes, and this was her doing face-to-face classes too. So I thought it was interesting, but her ReggieNet pages were just beautiful. They were just gorgeous, and I was like, I must have a ReggieNet page like hers. So there you go, Bri. I'm sending people after you to learn more about ReggieNet. But I learned a lot about ReggieNet from her, and I'm sure other people who I am now forgetting that also, I would go to for help with ReggieNet if I had a question here or there. So the other instructors were actually a resource for me. They were not just like a digital, we think of like tools and resources as like digital or like physical material tools, right?
Right.
But the other instructors themselves and the program, right, also offered things like workshops that I would attend, or ISU had workshops, this past summer to help with online teaching. And I recognize the students as a resource for me in thinking about designing the class, because especially going into the fall semester, I was thinking from the spring, what students gave me as feedback about the tools that worked for them and what didn't, and technology access that they had at home, or like internet access at home. So I was thinking a lot about, what they had told me and how they interacted with what I did for them last spring, which wasn't nearly as nice as what I had ready for the fall. Um, but they were also resources for me and thinking about the design of my ReggieNet page. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned that our peers are also resources for us too, because oh my gosh, like everyone has like so many cool things to show us and teach us that it's fascinating how much we can learn from each other in that sense.
Mhm.
And this community of learning that we've established too, and not only within our own cohorts, for example, but other cohorts, um, well, sorry, other people that are not necessarily on a cohort, but from the different years, different backgrounds and what they're studying too. I always remember when we were in person, Heather O'Leary will always give the workshops on using
Yeah.
technologies, like on Microsoft Sway, for example. I remember that Bree also gave that workshop about syllabus accessibility, and the way she designs her own syllabi is just beautiful as well. Um, and I need to make an admission of myself to start designing really not only beautiful syllabi design wise, but also accessible for the information. Like instead of just having blocks of paragraphs in my syllabi, I just want those to be in like very potential blocks of information, like if you want newsletter, for example, with images and like key information for students to quickly access, like okay, what are the assignments, what are the readings, what do I need to do, why do I need to do this. And I also think transparency and clarification of information is so important too. I think one of the most major things that a lot of us, not only including undergraduate students, but I can also speak for myself as a graduate student, is like keeping my mind not only towards the goal, but also the timing of deadlines and when projects are due. And I think that's really challenging in an online setting because like time and days are meaningless at this point. And it's like, oh, I have time to do this project, but it's like, oh no, I actually have 2 days to do this project. What's going on? And I think a lot of us feel that way too. And I think that's why it's important to kind of give that check in to students and also let them know, encourage them, and also support them at these times as well during the pandemic, because again, this pandemic has not been an easy transition for anyone.
Right. Yeah. And I think that some of the things as you're describing some of this, I'm thinking about the different tools that I was trying to use through the class that helped with thinking about things like, I think one of the realities we have to think about here too is that when I talk about a fall English 101 course, like that's all well and good, right? Like we're just instructors in the program. It's just whatever. It's just a 101. We have to remember too that these are likely 18, 19-year-old. Most of them are incoming freshmen. This is the first time that they've taken a college class. Not all, right? We recognize that not everyone coming into the English 101 classes in the fall specifically are, brand new freshmen, but many of them and most of the ones that I happen to have in my classes last fall were. And so I think one of the things that we have to remember too is that some of my goals, I've got the gears turning as I'm talking here. Some of my goals I think are kind of related to that, right? Like I'm keeping in mind that we have students that are still learning to navigate ReggieNet for the first time. So things like easy and accessible navigation is important all the time, but it's exceptionally important for students who are learning ReggieNet for the first time. And I'm sure that anybody that remembers their first time on ReggieNet remembers that it's not an easy program to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
At least it's not completely obvious, and it depends on how the class is set up and how easy it might be to find things. So I think some of this is really grounded in the fact that I'm thinking a lot about, making this accessible for those incoming freshmen and how important this is all the time, but it's exceptionally important for them as they make this transition into a college setting. Yeah, yeah. I'm
Yeah.
going to move us on, Edsel.
Yes. Let's keep going.
So what I have here on the presentation right now, just in case there's anybody who's listening and not seeing the video, what I have right now is an actual screenshot, or the best one that I could kind of cobble together because I had to scroll down the page page, taking pictures and putting this together. This is the best I could do to put together a screenshot of my second unit project. I call it the Day and Sound project. This is what an actual ReggieNet page looked like for all of my unit projects. Looked like this. I would change the colors just to make sure that there were visual differences. That way, if they misclicked, they were like, oh, this isn't the right, color. I'm not supposed to be looking for yellow and orange. I'm looking for blue and green, or whatever. So I tried to give them those kind of visual cues. But this is what it looked like, and I'm going to break down the different kind of sections and what I was thinking about in these different sections. One thing that I do want to draw our attention to before I switch to the next slide here, at the very bottom, you can see I have Unit 2 rationale and objectives. It gets cut off here, but this is actually something that I lifted from my course plan for Unit 2. Like, this is my justification. I did retranscribe it into more student-friendly language. So I left in the scholarship because I think that, of course, it's always important to show students how we're grounding what we do in scholarship and best practice and whatnot. But I think that other than that, it's really important that we answer that like, so what question, because again, that goes back to one of my goals that I was just talking about. So for me, one way that I saw that ReggieNet would let me, kind of, I guess, bring that goal to fruition here, it's so that I could always have this in front of students and reference it if they would like to see it again, is to just put that right on the unit page, right? So I used one of the text box tools using the ReggieNet lessons page editor thing, which is that's a whole workshop. So I'm not going to get into like how to do all that. I just want to acknowledge that there is a way to do it. But I just use the text box to put that in there, right? And it's just available. So that was a very simple way for me to kind of accomplish that goal and bring that into the page. Okay, I'm going to go into a kind of a quick breakdown of each section. So I just sort of zoomed in on it here. The very top here is the page header. So I have two things, and this is on every single unit page. I have these two icons. The first one is the project overview, and like the actual picture of the icon changes, of course, depending on what the project is. So the picture and the text are both hyperlinked to a PDF document that gives an overview of the project. And then there's the project folder, and that leads to this unit's shared folders. Students kept repeatedly telling me throughout the course, this is something I personally value, but the students were also repeatedly telling me through different feedback opportunities that I gave throughout the semester with like Google Forms, that they liked being able to, see what their peers were doing, do, peer feedback, and then just to sort of get a sense of like what other kinds of ideas did people come up with. None of the projects that I assigned were things that would be, things that the students could easily duplicate, from one another. They were all very like individual, and they, for many of them, they had to submit proposals and things like that. So I didn't have any worry about anything like that. And, all grading and feedback went through the assignments tool. So it was, of course, that was all, between me and the students. So there was nothing about grading in these folders, but that's what this is. So these were always at the top for me, because again, I'm thinking about ease of navigation, accessibility. I really want these to stand out. These are like the two most important things for them throughout the project. So that's why I was thinking about putting them there. To actually make these, I either made the picture in, I believe the Day and Sound project icon was something I made in Word. And then I actually used the snipping tool on my Windows computer to take a quick little picture of it and then saved that. So I just made it difficult. I could have probably just saved it some other way, whatever, it worked. And then the project folders icon, I just went to Google Images and just uploaded those onto the page here. So I didn't do anything fancy, but again, I'm thinking about like, what tools was I using, like for my Literate activity? What were my resources that I was pulling from? So I just want to make sure we're also, naming as those moments come up. So yeah, that was just the header of it. The weekly lesson pages box here, those buttons are actually separate lesson pages. If you click on them, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment, when you click on them, they take you to another page. So each week of a unit had its own lesson page where I was reminding them about readings or assignments or forum posts, things like that. So I can just go ahead and show you. This is an example of week 8. This was only a 3-week project. On the page, you can see on the top left, I have that yellow box where it's like, this is the deadline. Here is a checklist of the assignments or tasks for the week. So you can just check those off. It was totally optional. I always included a notes and thoughts box because, again, transparency was something that was very important for me. And using the text box tool, most of this is done in text box tool, and then I might insert tables or whatnot. Um, this was all done just through the lessons tool on ReggieNet, and I just insert text boxes. And so that this helped me achieve one of my goals, which is to always like share with students what I'm thinking, be very transparent about the work that we're doing, how the class is doing. This is the feedback you gave me, so here are some changes that we're making, yada yada yada. And then on the bottom of the page there, you can see that I have embedded a Google Doc, and then I have that yellow highlighted, like click here to go to the lesson page. So if students wanted to, they could open up the Google Doc and go through that themselves. One reason that I was thinking about actually making sure there was a separate option to go to look at that document page themselves is because they can enhance and zoom the page better, and it also has a better like e-reader available through Google Doc. I don't really like the one that ReggieNet has. So ReggieNet is not super like, if you have someone with like a visual disability or like an oral, like an auditory disability, it's
Mhm.
not super friendly for that. So it was very difficult for me to design my course thinking about those things. But I tried to at least make sure the Google Docs were available because those tend to be a little bit more friendly. So everything on the Google Doc embedded in the page is something that, like a YouTube video presentation or a reading assignment, like saying either it's in the grassroots journal book they have for the semester, or it's available as a PDF on the ISU writing program website. And then I would just like hyperlink it there. So that's what I did here. So again, I'm thinking about organization, ease of navigation, transparency, really grounding that so what question, and how I'm using these tools to do that. The Unit 2 project resources, this is actually, the top two are just me inserting like an external link that takes them to another file somewhere. This is just me repeating the project overview and the project folders link at the top. And then the bottom, I actually embedded the resources tool. So I hide the resources tool on the toolbar. You know how like on the left side of ReggieNet, it's like, your forms, your assignments, but you can put resources there. I hide that. Because I find the resources tool extremely difficult to navigate. So I hide it, I use it, and then I embed it into the page itself. So I can tell it specifically what folders in the resources tool on ReggieNet that I want it to show on this page. So I have a Unit 1 readings and resources, Unit 3 and Unit 4. You just don't get to see them here because I told ReggieNet I don't want to show those. So this is all stuff that we looked at in this unit. So you can see there's like a video link I put there. I have 2 web articles, and then I always include the ISU writing program link. And then I also had something called the Sounds of Street View, which was a website we were looking at. And then on the calendar over there, you can see it's currently showing April 2021. Because I'm guessing if I went back and looked at the calendar from at the time that I taught the class, it might look insane. So because it has 2 classes worth of material on there plus all the classes I was taking, so I didn't want to like bring all that up. It would look just like, oh my gosh, what is Leslie doing to these students? There's stuff every day. No, that was just all of my stuff plus 2 classes of English 101. So just know though that the calendar was embedded on the lesson page, so that way, like the unit page that I have here, so that they could always see, when are the unit project deadlines, when are the weekly lesson page deadlines, class meetings, things like that. So as you were saying earlier, Edcel, like trying to really keep on top of, when those due dates are, what we're doing, when we're doing it, right? Again, and always thinking about the fact that we're dealing with incoming freshmen here with a fall class. I wanted to make sure that calendar tool, and this is again just embedded the calendar tool into the lessons page from ReggieNet. I wanted to make sure that information was always in front of them. So
Yeah,
yeah, and I
and
think that's everything about the actual the example unit page. I'm going to go back here just so we can look at the whole thing while we talk about it.
no, this all looks super organized and super interesting. I was gonna say it was really funny how you mentioned the how you hit the resource tab because, like, the one thing I can never understand about the resource tab is that when you go to a certain folder to access readings, you can just backclick to take you to the main list of all the folders. Like it appears in
Yeah.
the same page unless you press again that folder icon at the top. And I'm like, but why would you do this, Regina? So it's
Yeah,
a
ReggieNet has some weird things. Like there's some black magic going on with ReggieNet sometimes.
no, yeah, I can definitely agree on that. Um, and it was funny how you mentioned that, oh, I'm not gonna show everything I had in my calendar, because oh my gosh, when I make my own calendars, it can get really crazy too. But it's also really good, especially lots of the detailing that goes into the individual pages, like each week, here are the week's goals or assignments that we're completing. Here's a checklist so you can remember, you know, that you have to complete this first and then go to the next item. And also,
Right.
and I really like how good, not only design wise but also accessible, the readings and resources look like. And specifically the labeling, I think it's also important, especially if you're
Yeah.
using different kinds of resources, not just articles, but here's a podcast, here's a blog from a website, here's a YouTube
Mhm.
video or a tech talk. I think that adds an extra nice little detail to let students know that articles aren't the only things that are valuable in either reading about academia or reading theory and such. Like, when we think of multimodality, and all these different mediums that we can use to express our academic work, it's really important to also show that to students that you know a lot of things have evolved, not just because of the pandemic, but also how we're kind of breaking away from the traditional and moving forward a more digital space into providing our scholarship and information and all these wonderful projects that we have in mind, not only for us planning and as instructors, but also for students to produce and do and venture in. Um, and I also find that really useful too, especially thinking this as a first year composition course or a first year English course for students. Um, and it's really different too because, like, I'm assuming that we get like students from a lot of different places, and
Mhm.
probably in schools, lots of them are used to technology. Some of them have been acquainted with technology before, maybe some of them have not, but it's always fascinating to like demonstrate that all these technologies and apps, like, these are things that are currently being used not only in college but also maybe in their future careers at one point.
Right. Yeah. I think that part of one of the things I was thinking about with this unit specifically, and um, I will talk a little bit more about the project, but I want to make sure that I don't fall into the trap of thinking about like, we should talk about the project itself, because the goal really that I'm trying to make sure we talk about today is just to stay super honed in on thinking about like the literate activity of an instructor in the
Mhm.
program and how we think about what an instructor is doing and what tools and resources that they're using, or how they're using them and thinking about using them before, right, it maybe even gets in front of the students. But I think that one of the things that I'm thinking about for this project specifically, because this one happens to be really focused on multimodality, right? We kind of get that from, the whole project is about sound, right? I think that one of the things I really valued with this project was kind of straying away from like written, like linguistic focused like modes of communication. So getting away from just like reading articles and thinking about videos as texts, right? Which is, so in unit 3, you can see that on the left bar there, I call it the CAG project. I call it chatting about genres, where I invite students to consider doing things like making a YouTube video. So one student that I'm thinking of off the top of my head made a beauty guru YouTuber style, like a how to like get ready with me style makeup tutorial type thing. Um, I think that became, just thinking about the flow of the class, right? How I'm scaffolding what they're learning. I think that because we did the multimodality unit prior to the thinking about genres and chat unit, it became more possible for them to imagine constructing a project that wasn't just alphanumeric based, right? So I think that by one of the things that they did for the Unit 2 project, and you can see that there with the video from Evelyn Glennie. She is a deaf percussionist. And she has it's kind of, I don't know if it's actually a TED talk or not, I'm forgetting now, but she does a presentation called How to Truly Listen. And she talks
Mm.
a lot about sound and embodiment, right? How she literally through her arms feels the drums when she plays them, or whatever instrument she's using. So it's that I think was an interesting video for them, and the forum posts that they wrote for that week would suggest so, because they don't think about those kinds of things typically. So I think that this was a particularly interesting project for the students to complete because the project was largely done through the oral mode, right? One of the tricky things that I was thinking about, having said all that, right, one of the tricky things I think that I was considering when I was designing like the ReggieNet space itself and the kinds of text that students would be accessing and the tools that I would need for all of this is thinking about trying to get myself thinking about other modes of communication and how I might do that. So in this unit, I mentioned earlier, let me get back to it. So this was the lesson page, the week 8 notes and thoughts. Week 6 and 7, which I don't have examples of here, I actually experimented with the students leaving verbal notes and thoughts. And we talked in class, I think we had
Oh.
class week 7 or week 8, we talked about the differences, and getting my notes and thoughts written versus hearing me say them. I also did one of my presentation videos with my camera off. I always recorded them with my camera on. But for that one, I recorded it with my camera off. And I asked the students in class, did you notice? And we talked about how some of the students said it made them uncomfortable, that they couldn't see me because they liked being able to see me. And I always made my camera, I stretched it out so it was a little bit bigger on the videos. Um, they liked being able to see me and it made them uncomfortable. So that was thinking about how I'm using the technology or choosing not to use it, right? Like in that moment, it's a small thing, but I chose to turn my camera off when I was recording with my Screencast-O-Matic screen recording tool. So that little thing was something I had pre-planned, right? That was part of my activity before it even got in front of the students because I was setting up for that conversation and thinking about how the oral mode and the visual mode affect us and what information we get or don't get when those modes are missing. Yeah.
Yeah, that all sounds really good. And like it's a little bit funny too because it's really interesting that um you know the students were comfortable enough to let you know that they felt uncomfortable when your camera was off. And I think that's really fascinating to achieve because ultimately, well, and also thinking about my own classroom setting, like I so value the comfort of my students as a classroom community and kind of like that comfort for them giving me that uptake too, as in what's working in class, what's not working in class, what do you think about the readings, like. And I always evoke that kind of comfort that if you really hate the reading, just let me know and I'll just replace it in the next following time I teach 170. Because and I'm using literature. It's funny using literature as an example because I always choose reading that I love and I appreciate a lot. But obviously, that's not the case for everyone. Probably what I find so fascinating, someone might find it like, no, this is not it. Please change it, that's all. But it's that kind of thinking too when we think about technology and other activities as well, in any classroom setting, and especially here thinking about a writing course, and a course where usually English 101 is most college students' first English class and college experience too. Well, first ever class, because I always remember one of my colleagues always say that, well, if you teach a 7:30 or 8 a.m. course, you're like the first face they see throughout the entire
Mm.
day. And it's like, wow, that's a lot of extra pressure because now I have to be the one to hype them up for the rest of the day. And just to get their day going in that sense.
No, I hear that. Well, and I think it's interesting too, because if we think about, like the instructor's literate activity within an activity system, right? The students are members of that community, right? If we think about like the activity system triangle, right? And if we
Right.
think about the community of it, students are part of that community, just like other writing program instructors are. So I think that when we're thinking about our course design, we can't discount the fact that there are other members of our community that are impacting the actual design of the course, right? And that's part of our literate activity and how we situated, thinking too about how we are kind of situating students in the class, right? Depending on how we think about the way that we design something like ReggieNet, right? Like how are we constructing our pages to invite students into doing this work with us, right? How are we thinking about having students, collaborate or to be thinkers alongside us in the work that we're doing? And so I think that, I keep going back to that goal of just thinking about accessibility and ease of navigation and the transparency. Those things are so important to me, because I value them so much, because I think it's so important that those are established, as something I'm doing and thinking about in my course design and the presentation of like a ReggieNet page, for example. I mean, because we can get into like, how am I using Word? How am I using slides, right? Like I could start pulling up the different slide presentations that I made for this semester, or going into, what was my literate activity, right, with making my presentation videos? Like what were all the specific tools and steps involved with that? And what were the decisions as I was making as I go? And how was I hoping students would take this up? So there's like all kinds of tools we could talk about here with this course design stuff. But I think that, when we're thinking about like the ReggieNet page tool specifically was kind of like like I said earlier, was the hub or the backbone of all the other tools, right? Which gets me to the last little bit here that I have for today. I've kind of already talked a little bit about the Unit 2 project at this point, so I don't want to spend too much time on the project description, just because I don't want to, rehash everything again. But just to reiterate, it emphasizes the oral mode. Some of the I'll say like major objectives that we were thinking about with it was how we experience the oral mode, different tools we use for composing or like thinking about like recording the oral mode, how we do that. Some of my students gave me some very interesting stories about how they heard birds outside their window and they wanted to record the birds, but they couldn't figure out how to record the birds. And some of them were in their dorm rooms, so they were doing crazy things like trying to open their windows and stick their arms out holding their cell phones. And I'm like, please don't do that. Because they really wanted to record like the wind outside, or crickets
Wow.
in the garden at night. They got really invested in, they wanted to record every sound, and they were frustrated because they couldn't figure out how to do that. And it's interesting thinking about the kinds of tools we need to have for the oral mode are very different than like the visual, which maybe would be, easier because you can just go out with your cell phone and just snap a picture of anything. Theoretically, right? We could talk about, complexities of the visual mode, but and then thinking about soundscapes, sonic experiences, and embodied listening, which Evelyn Glennie, I leaned on heavily for that part of it. If anybody's interested in pursuing a similar project, I think you would really enjoy looking at her stuff. And then attention to accessibility for people with visual impairments, who rely heavily on the oral mode, and thinking about like for people who have hearing disabilities, how they experience a world without that information, right? So we had a lot of conversations about accessibility, and is what Janine Butler calls multimodal in hospitality. So those were part of our conversations in this unit. So the project components, there were three parts of it. The project process log, this was their work journal. This was a renaming of a proof of learning text for me. I just didn't want to call it a proof of learning text for them. So we called it the project process log. The My Day in Sound audio file, which was literally them recording sounds throughout their day that they identified as they recorded tons of sounds, and I had to shrink it down for them to what did they consider to be their most significant or meaningful oral moments. I was highly amused at the number of alarm clocks that were in their videos. Those were significant sounds for their day. And then the third part was the artist statement, which was basically a synthesis of their learning throughout the unit. And then it was meant to be a document that they write for their peers, to explaining what their project choices were and what they were hoping to do with the project, or what they hope that it got across to their listener. So just with those three project components in mind, I'm going to, my last slide here for today, is additional thinking that I had to do. And again, this is all still part of my literate activity and prep for this class, right? What technology did I have to prepare for the students to use before they even were introduced to the unit? So I had
Right.
to think about things like, how are they going to make their audio files? So things like using their phones was like the biggest, but I also had to think about what resources might they have available, if they do live on campus, if they don't live on campus. So all of that was detailed in the project overview. Audacity is what I recommended they use. It's an editing program for audio files. Most of them actually opted to find their own audio editing programs, like apps on their phones. I thought that was very interesting, and I didn't expect that. So that was something beyond what I had imagined in my preparation. It was cool, but I didn't expect it. Compiling things like how-to guides, like YouTube resources. I recorded a couple guides on my own to help them with Audacity, workshopping in class. The project process log, I gave them the option to use anything they wanted to create that, except, so long as I had access to it. The artist statement was a Word or Google Doc, and then the self-assessment was basically a Word or Google Doc again. And then that was a between me and the student thing through the assignments tool. So this is the one time in this whole unit that I used the assignments tool in ReggieNet. But there it is. That was another tool that was part of my activity in preparation for this project. So I just wanted to end by saying, all of that stuff that I talked about on ReggieNet earlier and the design is important, right? But when we're thinking about like, this is a lesson page for this unit, right? We also think about when we're designing a unit, like thinking forward to what technologies we need to make sure are prepared or ready for, or what we have to prepare students for, whether that's like, I'm going to go and make a list of hyperlinks to, how to use Flipgrid, how to use Padlet, right? Like that's something we are still doing. That's a kind of text that we are creating for this unit. So we are creating, I created anyway for this unit, all kinds of texts and documents and resources. And I interacted with all kinds of texts and genres, right? To make this unit kind of come to life. And I think that I'll go ahead and stop sharing now so people can see our beautiful faces. I think that paying attention to our activity is so interesting because of the possibility for reflection and revision and offering students opportunities for feedback on that and thinking forward to future iterations of the course and what kinds of changes we might make, or what kind of work are we doing and how are we doing it, and getting back to what does this reflect about our goals and values, our teaching goals, like what are the things that we're doing, and like what are the tools we have access to that shape what we do. I think all those things in conversation with each other are really interesting.
Yeah, and they all interconnect so beautifully as well. Because thinking of my own teacher literate activity, it is a lot of thinking to go through. Like just this semester, I've been thinking a lot on my, because next year I'm teaching English 128, Gender and Humanities, and I'm just thinking of a lot of different things that revolves around that. Because like within that course, like I have the liberty to choose what I want to focus on, but it's also I'm thinking of accessibility too a lot in terms of like accessibility to reading material, for example. What options do students have? Do they have access to a public library, for example? Does our own Milner Library have the books I'm asking for, or is there like an ebook option? And that's just a little example of how many possibilities I'm thinking about in my own preparation as an instructor for this course, but also thinking back when I was teaching 101 for the writing program. It's also a lot to think about. There's of access. Like back in Stevenson, we have rooms with computers, so computers wasn't really a problem in those cases. But I also remember that I will recommend students to go to the library and use their borrow a laptop program, for example. If their own laptops like stop working, for example, because it can happen. um, or and also lead them to other resources that campus offers as well in terms of like who can check up on their laptops, repair, maybe getting access to a new one, and other things that evolve around just getting prepared for any situation that might happen in the classroom.
Yep.
And I really think as instructors, there's a lot of resources, not just for us as graduate students, but also as instructors as well. Like besides all some of the material we've mentioned in today's podcast, like lots of the free license, not free, some of the bought licenses that CTLT has for us, for example, that we can borrow or use from them.
Right.
Lots of the programs that are free, that one's free to access
Yep.
and download for us with our LS too. And also lots of training that, and instructor resources that they can offer us to learn new things and implement them in our own classroom. And I think all that is really important in order to grow as educators, as instructors, and just share the knowledge with our community as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that one of the things that I actually became more aware of because of the online teaching, because the need was there, right? Was the different kinds of digital tools or whatever you want to call them, platforms, whatnot, Padlet and things like that, that we actually do have access to through CTLT or through ISU generally, and we just don't use them or we don't know about them. I found that I used Adobe Spark far more than I ever thought I would in my life. Making images and things, not just stuff. It's one thing to be like, oh well, you're just using Adobe Spark to make pretty things. I mean, well, yeah, I am, but I also made some things that were actually useful to the students, to assist them in either kind of like making visual representations of concepts that I thought that having a visual representation of it would help them kind of understand it a little more. Or like graphics of like the journeys that we're taking, or like step one, step two, kind of chunking out a unit plan and like making an image of that. Not most people, I think, don't know that Adobe Spark is available for free for us, and that it's really easy to use. Like it is incredibly easy to use, very user friendly. And then just like having Screencast-O-Matic free was a huge lifesaver for me, because I've never really done screen recording prior to teaching online, for ISU. So I didn't know where to go. And so finding out that that was available through ISU was a huge lifesaver. But I could actually see using that in a face-to-face class still. Like it's not like all this stuff has to go away once we're back to face-to-face. Yes, they will be seeing us in person, so we can have some of these conversations at that time, right? But I do think that some of the videos that we made for our classes over this year are still useful, right? If you make like a 15, 20-minute video explaining a concept, why not still have your students, look at that, like that
Hmm.
tool and resource. You made this thing, it's still there, it's still a resource for your teaching, and why not? And so I think that we should not make the mistake of overlooking the potential usefulness of these different programs that we've learned how to use by necessity this past year. I think we should not make the mistake of overlooking them and their potential in a face-to-face class as well.
Yeah, no, I very much agree on that. And since we invested so much time in creating these resources, let's not like reinvent the wheel or just create a bunch of new videos.
Yeah.
Let's just use what we made and find a use for them. um
Mhm.
at least that's what I think in terms of like practicality, but also giving value to our work that we have done and all the work we were able to produce during this online pandemic.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So, Leslie, thank you so much for joining me in today's session. I had a lot of fun talking to you, but also learning about your own teacher literate activity and all the wonderful things you've done with ReggieNet. I am going to do my best and work on my own ReggieNet pages and maybe use Adobe Spark too, because I've always been interested in using it. But I guess I've always thought that, oh, I don't have the designer coding skills or whatever I was thinking about to use those programs. But I don't know, you convinced me. So I need to download that and get into that this summer.
Yes, for you and anybody else listening that would hesitate about using something like Adobe Spark specifically in this case, just try it out. It's so easy to use. It's just incredibly user friendly, and they pre-make graphics so you can just select one that you like and then just edit fonts or whatever. It's so incredibly easy to use. Give it a try. You'll figure it out within 5 minutes.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. I can't wait to test it out. All right. And thank you so much to our audience for listening to us today. Um, There'll be lots of exciting new news for the writing program and other projects looking our way in the near future. So I hope you join us again in a near activity where we either talk about technology or do anything else regard to the writing program. So until next time, goodbye everyone.
Bye, everyone.